started feeling bad like a day ago, but guess I'll power through it.
Oh, sorry to hear that.
Yeah.
I like your little unicorn thing on your wall.
Oh, yeah. Thank you.
Uh, all right. It looks like we're live. I'll just check on my YouTube page, which I'm not currently logged in on. Twitch account. Freaking Pine Creek doing a stream right now at the same time. All right, it looks like we're live. So, Mouthy, thanks for coming on. Appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Yeah, I'm the Infidel. I have a YouTube channel with that title. I generally like to talk about politics, philosophy, that sort of thing. I also write articles for people who subscribe to my Patreon. And I have a Twitter called Mouthy Infidel, where not much of consequences posted. So yeah, I guess that's pretty much all that I do.
Yeah, I post pretty much nothing of consequence on any of my platforms.
Yeah.
So yeah, you wanted to talk about morality, and I wanted to talk about socialism versus capitalism a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a preference on which one you want to start with?
We can go wherever. We don't even have to talk about morality if you don't want to. It's just an idea that was floated. But yeah, we can go wherever. I'm not sure what your thoughts are on either of these topics, really. So, guess I'm
Sure.
just going in blind for the most part.
Yeah, so my view is that capitalism has advantages over socialism. I don't think it's moral in any way, but I think it works better. So if you think of the two as like competing bacteria, capitalism will work better and survive more and reproduce more and have a higher creation rate, and has more safety net resources. So like if you don't have to pay your employees as much and you can fire them, essentially they act kind of like a spare limb, like, you know, those geckos who, if their tail gets bitten, they just drop off the tail. If a company goes into debt or there's an economic crisis or a pipe burst and you have to spend $50,000 to fix the building, if you just lay off a big portion of your employees, that saves a ton of money for the company. And that's an option that capitalist companies have that socialist companies don't, because they usually have a lot more restrictions of what they can do with their employees. They have a lot more rights in that case, which is more moral, but at the same time, it's a lot more liability that the company has in socialism that it doesn't there in capitalism, which gives capitalist companies more survivability. Also, because of the higher profit rates, more people are more likely to start a capitalist company than a socialist company, and because of the retry rate is also higher. So the retry rate meaning that if you start a company because you're making more money, in a capitalist company, even if it fails, you're more likely to start another company. Whereas if you don't make as much money, you're not as likely to start another one under socialist platform, because since you haven't made enough to justify the amount of work you've put in, it's less likely you're going to start a new one. Whereas since you're making more money, it's more likely you're going to start a new one under capitalism, because it takes less time to get to that threshold of making significant amounts of profit to justify what you're doing. Capitalist companies also have greater diversity, like because you are less financially responsible to your employees and you can give yourself more money, it's easier to make money, and leading to not only more company creation, but more diverse kinds of company creation. Because again, you're more inspired to try and make more companies, you're more inspired to make different kinds of companies, most of which will probably fail, but it will lead to a higher rate of company creation and a higher diversity of company creation. And you have a much higher likelihood of outside investment in capitalist companies. So since a lot of the return can come from investors, and investors are going to make more money giving to capitalist companies than to socialist companies, they're more likely to invest. So for all these reasons, it's significantly more likely that a capitalist company would be successful in a socialist one in most scenarios, because they have advantages that are essentially, if considered evolutionary advantages, would give them a significant more weight of being a more successful organism.
Okay, so, and when you say a socialist company, I guess I imagine you're referring to like worker cooperatives.
In a sense, yeah, I don't think they're strictly socialist, but that's closest.
Okay. So my I mean, I guess maybe we could get into some of the details of some of the points you raised. Or more generally, I guess my sort of model of socialism is maybe a bit different than the sort of classic let's just mandate workers cooperatives that you probably hear from a lot of socialists or market socialists. Um, so I guess if you want, I could just lay out sort of what I'm proposing, and then maybe you could tell me which of those points, or if there are any other points you think that apply specifically to what I'm proposing.
All right.
So basically, on the model of socialism that I propose, there's a heavy emphasis on public ownership or state ownership of enterprise, and that can come in a variety of forms. So there are general government services like the post office. There are state-owned enterprises. Generally just like nationalized industries. Or no, I guess the post office would be more like a state-owned enterprise, and something like government funded and run education, that would be more like a general government service, or like government funded and run healthcare would be like a general government service. And so on the model of socialism that I propose, many industries would just be nationalized. So healthcare could probably be nationalized. Things like schooling, the post office, maybe the fossil fuel industry, many key sectors could just be open to traditional nationalization. And then in sectors where we want to still have basically a market for allocating goods, we could introduce state ownership in the form of something like a social wealth fund, which just means that the government essentially buys up stock in all of the competing companies in a given market. And the revenues of those companies go to the state to be distributed for social welfare purposes, and also the state has some sort of ability to some degree, control the activities of the companies in questions, in all the ways that traditional shareholders can influence the behaviors of the companies that they own shares in. And then, of course, on the other side of the coin, because I think like worker empowerment is also an important element of socialism, I think that things like co-determination policies, which give workers, percentages of stock ownership in the companies that they work at, and policies that allow workers to like manage their own workplaces. I think those are also very important. And then also like large sectoral unions and so on. And so that's like generally the model of socialism that I advocate for.
So just to be clear, do you think the government should buy a majority share in the stock of the company?
I think that would be the goal, yeah, that for the state to be like the majority shareholder in the major companies in most industries.
Yeah, so the two big problems I see is that given that that's the case, most people wouldn't start companies because they start companies to make money. That's the point. And so if the government's going to be a majority share and the people lose control over their business, they're less likely to start a business. So the creation rate problem was the same in both. Second, the survivability problem is the same in both because, like you said, there's a lot more rights of workers, and if there are more rights to workers, that's a huge liability in case there's a financial crisis. So somebody in the chat asked, "What's the benefit of?" What was it? Find the question. It was a good question. Why is success more meaningful than workers' rights and privileges? And the reason is because if a company like survives, say a company employs 5,000 people, and then it has an economic crisis and lays off 3,000 people, then when it recovers, it can rehire 3,000 people, maybe a different 3,000 or whatever. But if the company doesn't survive, then that's 5,000 people who all lose their jobs. So if you lay off 3,000 now and the company survives, then you can re-employ 5,000 in the future. But if you don't lay off 3,000, then you have a lot of obligations to your employees, which causes the financial stability of the company to fall below the threshold where it can maintain itself into bankruptcy. Then all 5,000 lose their jobs. So the fact that a company has less obligations to maintain their employees' financial security means that they can use them, kind of like the newt example I gave, where it just drops off its tail and can survive and grow another tail. And that is more beneficial to the economy than one that ties itself to its employees in a more moral way, adding a lot of liability that can then end the company. So I'd see that your model does have many of the same problems I mentioned.
Okay, so I mean, the first thing you mentioned, I guess we can start with that, is the sort of creation problem. So I guess I'm not really understanding the point there, because if my model of socialism essentially just has, key industries are nationalized, and then the state basically plays the role of a massive index fund. Or we could, I mean, this gets into more complicated territory, but there's always the option of breaking up the social wealth fund into mutual government operated competing social wealth funds. So if we just have the state playing the role that index funds already play, it's not clear why there would be a creation of an extra disincentive for starting businesses, right? You say that people start businesses to make money. Well, yeah, but if you start a company and then you make that company go public, and then an index fund buys shares in your company, well, that does make you money. That's how people who have public companies already make money. And so it's unclear why they would be disincentivized if all of a sudden, instead of private index funds buying up shares in the company that you created, it was instead a state-owned index fund or something like that.
That's why I asked the question about the majority shareholder. So if most of the index funds aren't the majority shareholder is usually the owner until they sell the company. And so if the goal is to be a majority shareholder, that would disincentivize the people from wanting to start companies here, because they want to be the majority shareholder so that they have control over their company.
I don't think that the majority of publicly traded companies are majority owned by their founder. And
They
if you
usually
say
are.
that,
They usually start all that way.
well, they might start that way, but I don't think that many companies last that way for a long period of time.
I think they do, because in order to go from because the majority of the shares are owned by the founder, and then they start to sell shares, and it's usually they sell at like 40% of their shares, and then in order to lose the majority shareholder, they'd have to create more shares and not give themselves more shares, which usually doesn't happen. It usually goes to like the CEOs. So the majority shareholders usually stays to be the founders, and the CEOs of the company are usually the majority shareholders, and the excess shares are sold to the public. But in a degree that most of them don't really have more control than the CEO. So the reason you don't need specifically like 51% of the shares is because if the CEO has 20% and the founder has 25% or whatever, that's enough to be able to control everything in the company. Because if random people have like 7%, that's going to not have a significant impact on the outcome of what the companies do. So because it's not as centralized, the CEO will still have control and overall say in what happens in the company, and the shareholders won't be able to overrule them. And that's something that CEOs specifically design into their stock options. They want it that way for very good reasons.
Yeah, so I mean, with respect to the question of what percentage of publicly traded companies on the stock market are majority owned by their founders, I'm not sure. I mean, I guess I would need to see some statistics on that. I think it's unlikely that most publicly traded companies are majority owned in terms of shares by the founder, but I would just need to see some statistics on that if that were the claim.
Well, it's founder and the whatever the top CEO, COO, CFOs, those people hold the majority shareholders, or enough to be able to make all of the decisions. So there's several ways to get around having the majority. Like if you sell enough stocks to enough diverse groups and not to one specific group, you can have 20% of the shares and still decide everything in the company, because the other people are going to vote in different directions and not have a unified group against you. So the reason they allocate stocks in the way they do is to maintain control of the company. And if your goal in the government is to take away that control, they're not going to want to do that.
Yeah. So,
thanks for the super chat,
so,
Frank.
so I would say a few things. I mean, for one, for one, I mean, I guess I would just, I mean, I don't really know how to respond to this point, just because I would need to see some sort of statistical or empirical evidence with respect to the extent to which publicly traded companies are owned by their majority of the shares are owned by their founders and so on. But I mean, even granting the point, I mean, at best, this seems like it would be some sort of an argument for why we might want to establish some sort of extra incentive under socialism for creating businesses to counterbalance that sort of reduction in incentive that you're talking about. And there's other countervailing forces within socialism that I think might increase the rate of startups, contrary to decreasing the rate of startups. So, for example, I think socialism, relative to even something like welfare capitalism, would be able to garner significantly more amounts of revenue to be allocated for social welfare purposes. And we have pretty decent empirical evidence that when more is spent on social welfare purposes, more people end up starting businesses. I mean, for one, because they have more money to save, so they're more likely to start a business. And secondly, because, I mean, the less money you have, the more risk is involved in starting a business. If you work for a company and your healthcare is tethered to that company, then leaving that company to start a business is putting your healthcare at risk. Whereas if you had a much more robust system of redistribution and social welfare, you would be more likely, more capable of starting a company, because you know that you would be able to pay for your healthcare regardless of whether or not you keep your job. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you froze for a second there.
Okay. Yeah, so, I mean, the point is just, it seems like under socialism, people still would, I mean, even if I grant your point, which just seems to me to be some sort of undetermined empirical question, even if I grant that point, people still would make money from starting businesses under socialism. And we could even create some sort of extra incentive for doing so. That rewards people for starting businesses, even if the state eventually comes to have ownership. We could also do things like tax credits to incentivize starting businesses. There are a variety of things that we could do. And in addition to the fact that we could add those extra incentives, there already are countervailing forces within socialism that incentivize business creation, like the fact that we would have more of a robust system of redistribution under socialism.
So I would disagree with that. I was recently talking with Ben Burgess about this. He's also a proponent of socialism, and he showed me the papers, and we were discussing the creation rate of socialist countries all around the world. And he granted that, yeah, socialist countries aren't really created at the same rate as capitalist countries, not even close. And so that's
do you mean companies?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, companies in countries. So socialist companies are not created at the same rate in even socialist countries that do offer many of the things you're saying, because people like capitalist companies better, which is why he advocates that it has to be forced to start socialist companies, not capitalist ones, which I think is a problem. So given the data, it seems like socialist companies are just not created at the same rate for a number of reasons, like the cooperation requirements, the extra expenditure on the employees. Those significantly outweigh any benefits of just simple tax things. Like the fact that you have to invest so much more in your employees and you lose so much of the power, especially by giving them stock options right off the bat, is a significant risk and something people just don't like to do. So based on the data he showed me, I don't have the paper with me, that the creation rate of socialist companies is just objectively not as good.
Yeah, so when he talks about, so I know Ben Burgess is, I think like some sort of co-op socialist, and when Ben Burgess talks about the startup rate of socialist companies, I imagine he's talking about something like worker cooperatives, which I guess isn't. I mean, I'm fine with worker cooperatives. I think there might be some place for worker cooperatives in socialism, but I'm not as big on that. And when it comes to whether or not the countries that resemble the policies that I'm talking about have enough business creation, um, uh, it seems to me that the countries we would want to look to might not be the countries that you're thinking of,
What
given
countries
that.
should we look to?
So I would say that the countries that we should look to, when it comes to my proposal, right? So basically, nationalize a lot of industries, create a social wealth fund, a robust system of redistribution, some co-determination policies, and robust sectoral unions. The countries that most closely resemble this policy, these policies, are undoubtedly the Nordic countries. And we can look to the creation of startups in the Nordic countries. I mean, the OECD tracks a statistic called the enterprise birth rate, which is basically just calculated as the percent of businesses that are less than a year old. And in Sweden and Finland and Denmark and even Norway, the enterprise birth rate is even higher in the Nordic countries than it is in the US, despite the fact that they've, not to the same degree I would, but have moved much further in the direction of what I'm advocating for. So insofar as we were trying to do cross-country comparisons to try to analyze the impact of these policies on enterprise startups, it doesn't seem like the impacts you're talking about are substantiated.
Well, I don't see the government taking a majority shareholder in like any of those companies. So I don't know. I don't know why that's a parallel. Like, I'm totally for governments creating funds to help companies. That's not socialist. I wouldn't say, but the companies themselves are still function as capitalist, privately owned. The owners do everything they want, kind of a thing. Can fire whoever they want, kind of a thing. I
Well,
don't.
that's not true.
It's
Um,
much
I
more
mean,
true.
the Nordic countries have robust labor protections. It's way harder to fire somebody in a Nordic country than it is in the US. I mean, if you want to look at like the labor protection index, I mean, the Nordic countries have like 70 to 90% union coverage, which severely hinders the ability of capitalist enterprises to operate how they want to operate. So, like, yeah, I mean, I agree that in these countries, and by the way, Norway does have a social wealth fund, and the government is not a majority shareholder in most companies, but it does have a pretty robust stake in the domestic Norwegian market. And so I agree that the Nordic countries aren't exactly what I'm advocating for. I think I even qualified that when I originally brought them up. The point is just that they're way further in the direction that I'm advocating for than the United States. And contrary to us starting to see the negative effects of these policies that you're talking about, in fact, we see that despite being much further in the direction of what I'm talking about, they actually have more robust business startups and so on. And so, yeah, I guess so. I mean, on a mechanistic level, I can see your sort of mechanistic speculation for why what I'm talking about might disincentivize business startups. But at the same time, there are all sorts of countervailing mechanisms like the ones that I mentioned, and there are, and so if we're going to try to analyze this complicated empirical question, it seems like we need to look towards the empirical evidence, and at least if we're going to go by the sort of cross-country, cross-sectional approach that you originally invoked, it doesn't seem like the empirical analysis points in the direction of these policies causing the harms that you're alluding to.
Well, again, I said the majority shareholder. So if you're not the majority shareholder and you're just giving companies money as the government, well, we already do that too in America. So that I don't think that is a parallel to what you're saying, because the whole
It's
point
not
here
one to
is,
one.
well,
I
'cause
mean, it's not one
the
to.
whole point I made was that it has to be, if your goal is a majority shareholder, that's the disincentive. If your goal is just to give money to people and be a partial shareholder, yeah, they're going to take your money. That's not a problem. Capitalists are happy with that too. So I'm not seeing the problem there. That doesn't really address the creation rate problem.
So, I mean, I don't. So I mean, I guess when you say so I mean, I guess like here's where I'm coming from. It just seems like when you're gonna say these policies that you're advocating for, they're going to decrease the ability of capitalists to do what they want to do with their enterprises. Um, and they're going to take power away from the capitalist over their own enterprise, and that's going to decrease the amount of startups in the country. um, well, it seems like the Nordics clearly have implemented policies which robustly impact the ability of capitalists to do what they want with their own enterprises, right? There are, like I said, there are massive sectoral unions that are very influential. There are some co-determination policies. There's to some degree a social wealth fund. There are way more robust like corporate taxes. Um, and so uh, it just seems like even if these countries aren't exactly what I'm proposing, if you were right that the kinds of policies I'm proposing have this disincentive impact, then at the very least, we should expect to see that when we look towards the countries that are further in that direction, that they, maybe not to the same degree that would exist under my socialism, but they at least should to some degree be seeing these negative impacts. But I don't think that that's really been established.
Well, because my argument wasn't that any limitation on capitalist freedom did decreases the rate of company growth. It's specifically the majority shareholder part. So there's some things that would have an impact, not everything. Like obviously there are laws in America and those are also restricting what you can do with your company. Like you can't make a slave trade. So clearly those exist everywhere. And I agree that doesn't
But much
necessarily
more
mean,
so in the Nordics.
I don't know if that's the case. Like, because the amount of laws in both places is a lot. There's still a lot of laws in both places. I don't know if it's significantly much more in Norway. But again, the argument is that some ways, like majority shareholder, is a big problem that people would not like, whereas just having unions doesn't really compare to that.
So, I mean, with respect to whether or not, I mean, firstly, with respect to whether or not the Nordics do have more restrictions on how capitalists can operate in the way that they want. I mean, specifically with respect to with respect to like regulations, I don't think we have a very good metric for that. But I mean, if we just want to look at things like the strictness of the employment protection index for the United States, that number is like 1.17 restrictiveness rating, and for Sweden, that's like 2.52. I mean, there's like drastic differences. And then like percentage of workers covered by union contracts, and in the US that's like 12%, and like the Nordics it's like 90 to 80%.
Also, I
And
wanted to
so
mention that that doesn't actually affect the companies can still fire like 30% of their employees in any kind of serious like economic downturn. They still have the right to do that. Like Norwegian law only protects them against unfair dismissal. So if they like lose a large portion of their company, they can fire 30% and they still have a right to do that.
would you say that it's as hard to fire a worker in Finland with 93% worker coverage by union contract rates? You think it's equally hard to fire a worker in Finland as it is in the US?
Uh, no, I think it's definitely a little harder, but they're still capitalist companies, so they can still
I mean,
fire a
it's
large portion of their employee base without a problem. If they're socialist companies like co-ops, they can't do that because they own the company.
right. Well, I mean, again, I'm not necessarily advocating for co-ops, but also I mean, it's not just a little bit harder. I mean, there was a story about I think a Finnish MP, I think, who attempted to slash the pay of some small subsection of federal workers, and due to 93% sectoral union coverage, there were mass general strikes, which forced her to step down. I mean,
Well,
I
that's
can
a
imagine something
government
like that
employee.
happening.
I'm not sure how that relates to like companies here. Like if a government
Well, we're
employee
talking about the protection of workers,
from their
and the
employers,
effectiveness of unions.
like a
And in this
government.
case, the employer was a government worker.
Yeah, but so it's always harder for government workers to do that, even in the U.S. to try and cut like the UPS
That's
pay or
not in
something.
dispute. We're not talking about whether it's harder for government workers to fire workers compared to private sector workers. We're talking about whether or not employers generally, in countries with less robust union coverage, are more able to um, cut pay and fire workers compared to in countries with more union coverage. And
Right,
I
and
mean, the answer is just obvious. I mean, I don't know why this is being
well, no,
disputed,
no, no. So
really.
your example doesn't apply here. So I agree that there is some difference, but not a significant difference. So like in what I consider normal socialist companies, there is a significant difference in like trying to fire people in workers' co-ops is significantly harder than firing people in a capitalist company. In Norway, you can still fire people at pretty much the same rate if there's an economic need. I don't bringing up an MPs and public officials doing anything that people don't like can get them to lose their job. So it's extremely hard for any MP to ever
Not
cut
really, not in
costs.
the US. In the Nordics, sure, because they have huge unions, but that's my entire point, right? Um, and I mean,
But that doesn't
like, look,
compare.
you
Like the
keep saying
political figures aren't comparable to company figures here.
well, that's not the claim. Um, but I mean, if you want to I mean, if you want to move off this example specifically, um, I mean, do you know what the Employment Protection Index is, or the Employment Protection Legislation Index? Um,
A
I mean,
measurement.
I wouldn't imagine that you are like, have like read up on these statistics. It's kind of a niche thing, but like, so basically, the Employment Protection Index, um, essentially is calculated along a bunch of different items. Basically, there are three main areas which the Employment Protection Index is looking at. The first one is employment protection of regular workers against individual dismissal. The second is specific requirements for collective dismissals. And the third one is the regulation of temporary forms of employment. Um, and so uh, this is the exact kind of thing we're talking about. It's trying to measure how easy it is for companies, even private companies in various countries, to fire workers and to those kinds of things. And it just so happens that in the Nordic countries, there's not a slight difference. I mean, you said there might be like a slight difference, but no, it's like, I mean, it's like the Nordic countries have scores that are like 2 times higher than the United States. I mean, it's not even comparable. Um, and so, and it seems like you also just kind of want to say, well, sure, the Nordic countries in a variety of ways make it harder for capitalists to operate how they want. But I think specifically the one way, the one form of this interference, which is going to be like uniquely harmful, and like drastically decrease business startups or something, um, it's going to be having majority shareholders, majority government shareholders in private companies. But I mean, I just don't know why that would be this like unique exception. Um, and I mean, I guess I would need some sort of like reason for thinking that that's some sort of unique exception.
Because if the government takes the majority share of a company, people aren't going to make the company in the first place.
Well, that's just restating the claim I was asking you to explain.
Why, if someone else is going to take your company, you wouldn't bother starting the company? Like,
Right.
is that not just obvious? Like, if I'm going to do the work to
No.
plow the field and somebody else takes my field, am I going, and I know it's going to happen, am I going to do the work? No.
Well, you would still have some ownership of the company, you'd still have some say over the company, and you would still, I mean, when the government buys shares, that's giving you money. And you would still, I mean, there are other things we could establish in some sort of a socialist society, such as like more social incentives, um, uh, that sort of thing for people who create successful companies that, better the world. Um, so I mean, yeah, I mean, there's just a variety of conceivable reasons why one might start a company. It's still going to make them money. They're going to get social credit for it. They're still going to have some influence over how the company operates. And so, I mean, I would grant that there might be some disincentive impact, but if you want to prove that that disincentive impact would be significant enough to um, override all of the countervailing mechanisms which might actually increase startups under socialism, and B, that it would override those countervailing mechanisms to such a degree that startups would be decreased to such a massive extent that this would override all the other benefits of having a socialist economy. I mean, I feel like there's a lot of empirical work to be done there that just hasn't been substantiated.
Sure. I guess we could do more work in that. Another thing is those examples again. They're not in any way socialist. Like any one of those countries, you ask them, are they socialist? They say no, we're not in any way. Like just reading off the Norway website, the simple fact is Scandinavian countries are not, by any reasonable definition, socialist. So I don't think that's a comparison you can make in any respect.
So I think that when it comes to the word of politicians in the Nordic countries, I mean, I don't think that that's a great data point, because I mean, if you ask Donald Trump, why is the American economy great? He'll say like, oh, free enterprise and capitalism. If you ask Bernie Sanders, he'll say, oh, no, America is very socialist already. We have the post office and we have all these other programs. So like, of course, politically biased politicians are going to want to characterize their economies and their economy's success in the ways that correspond to their political ideologies. But I mean, I feel like when we talk about like Nordic politicians talking about whether the Nordic experiments or the Nordic social democratic experiments, whatever you want to call them, whether or not those are socialist, I mean, it feels like you're just cherry picking. I mean, there are
I agree.
tons of
I don't
Nordic
care about the
socialists.
politicians. The politicians don't matter. Care about the economists. In the economic fields, these are defined as mixed economies, just like America's a mixed economy. It's not a socialist economy. So all of the experts in economics say these are mixed economies. They're not socialist economies by any measure.
So I kind of agree. I wouldn't characterize the Nordic economies as fully socialist. But I mean, the idea that we shouldn't be talking about the Nordics in the context of evaluating the merits of socialism, I mean, that's something I disagree with. I would be prepared to affirm that the Nordic countries are much further in the direction of socialism compared to, say, the US. So, like, for a few examples, if you want to, just looking for like metrics which might hint towards how socialist a country is, like percentage of workers employed by the government in the United States, last I checked, that's around like 14.5%. In Norway, that's like 34.5%. So, like, more than a twofold increase. Nordic countries have way more strict employment protection indexes, way more percentage of workers covered by union contract, and even way more state ownership. I mean, in Norway, the value of state-owned enterprises as a percentage of GDP, last I checked, is around 90%. In the United States, it's literally less than 1%, right? And so the idea that like the Nordics and the US are kind of just like somewhere near each other, both kind of mixed economies, it's not really true. I mean, the Nordic countries are far and away extremely more socialist than the United States is. And they're not, I don't think they're fully socialist, but the fact that they're way further in that direction and yet still have very thriving economies, and really none of the worries that you mentioned have even started to come to fruition, I think that's at least like, to some degree, a data point that counts in favor of my suggestion. It's obviously not the strongest, right? I mean, any just cross-country, cross-sectional analysis is going to be pretty weak because we could always do more specific empirical analysis of to what factors do these countries actually owe their success. I mean, it still could be that the socialist policies are dragging them down, but that they just have other, positive elements. I'm not sure that's the best explanation for Nordic success, but yeah, I mean, I think that at least counts in favor of the kind of argument that I'm trying to make.
Well, to be clear, so I don't have any problem with the Norwegian models. Like, I think those are capitalist. So when I'm complaining against socialism and capitalism, I'm not using America as the standard of capitalism. I don't think America does good in anything. America's shit. So it seems like you're arguing, like, for my case, because the capitalist countries are doing really good in Norwegian. Like, okay, I agree. But they're not socialist. I don't. So for me, it's a weird comparison that I'm not quite tracking. Like, yes, I'm not saying all socialist policies are bad, but so if all you're advocating for is that, I'm fine with that. I just will call that capitalism.
So I guess to draw like some sort of an analogy, maybe we could. So imagine we were trying to like evaluate the merits of something like monarchy, right? And we had a bunch of countries, and there were countries that ranged from complete like direct democracy to like absolute non-constitutional monarchy, and then there were like a bunch of countries in between. But there weren't many on both sides of the extreme. Most of them are some mix. And then imagine I was proposing like we should institute complete, absolute monarchy, and you were like, well, no, I mean, I think it would introduce all of these problems, and I think that um, I think that would introduce all of these problems and all of these worries, and I think that it would end up working really badly. And then if I were able to say, well, no, I mean, we can look at all of these countries that are way closer to an absolute monarchy than they are to, most. Than like most governments are, right? So like most governments are something bordering on like a representative democracy, and then there were some countries that were almost a dictatorship, but not completely. And I were to say, well, look, if we look to these countries, they're actually quite successful. I don't think you could just hand wave that by saying, well, they're not absolute democracies, because the point is they're further in that direction. And so if you're right that my model of socialism would introduce all of these problems, then what we would expect is that when countries move closer to that model of socialism, we start to see these problems emerging, and we start to see the economies becoming less and less successful. But the fact that we don't see that, I think, sort of introduces a problem for that argument.
I don't think so, because I'm for mixed economy. So it's like a bell curve where in the middle, a combination of both policies is the best. And if you go too far to the right, it goes down. And if you go too far to laissez-faire capitalism, it's a terrible idea. So the fact that adding some socialist policies, or what seems like socialist policies, can have a benefit, like, obviously I agree that can happen. So that wouldn't be evidence for your case, since what I'm arguing is that the extreme is the problem. And are you saying that the Norwegian companies are close to everything you want? Like, they're like really close to your socialist idea? Because if so, I'm fine with that. I just call it capitalism because they're capitalist countries.
So I think that they're pretty close. I don't think that they're like exactly there. So I think that like I think like Norway would be the closest, because Norway does have a lot of public ownership. I think if Norway had, more public ownership over its domestic market, then I think it would basically, I think I would probably be comfortable classifying itself as socialist. But last I checked, I think like Norway's ownership over its domestic market is something like maybe 30%, although I could be getting that number wrong. It's been a while since I read about this. But so yeah, I would say that they're pretty close. But I mean, I guess it's important to keep in mind like I guess the dialectical context here, because I mean the only reason I really brought the Nordics up is just because you mentioned that I was, bringing up some challenge where I was saying, well, on purely theoretical, like mechanistic grounds, it seems like we have mechanisms in both directions when it comes to the impact of socialism on business startups. And so if you want to substantiate your point, we might want to look more into the empirics. And then you said, well, empirically, when we look towards countries that are more approximating the kinds of things you're advocating for, we do start to see these problems. And
Yeah.
then I said, well, I mean, the countries that most closely approximate what I'm advocating for actually don't see these problems at all. Actually, they have higher business startups. And then you said, well, those aren't exactly what
Well, yeah, because
you're
I see those are
advocating for.
mostly closer to my side. Those are capitalist countries. You're listing capitalist countries and saying, these are examples of socialism when they're not. Like one of the people in the chat brought up Stringjet. Companies in Norway can fire all of their employees if they can't afford them. They can do exactly the things I'm saying. The fact that they get more score on some measurement metric doesn't mean that they're not capitalist countries that can essentially just fire most of their employees if they can't afford them. They still have the exact same rights in capitalist countries. Not America's garbage. So America can do lots of stupid things. I agree. But those are still examples of they have all the rights to do the things I said before. They can, if they have a bunch of employees that there's an economic downturn, they can just fire 3,000 of them and rehire them later. They have every right to do that. There's a term for it.
Well, I mean, it's the extent to which they have a right to do that. I mean, if you just mean that they can do it, like it's not illegal to fire employees under every circumstance, then I would just say, fine, then the model of socialism that I'm advocating for, equally, you'd have a right to do it. Like, I don't think any socialist, at least not any sane socialist, would advocate for a system wherein, like, you literally, no company can legally, like, fire its employees. But I think that if we wanted to think about the ability to fire as being on some sort of spectrum where it can be harder to fire your employees in some countries and easier in some other countries, then surely, I mean, based on the sorts of metrics like the Employment Protection Index and so on, it undeniably is much harder to fire employees in the Nordics. So yeah, I mean, I'm not but I mean, I guess it's not that important a point if you don't want to talk about the Nordics as much.
Well, I mean, I'm happy to. I just think they're capitalists. They're good examples of good capitalism doing capitalist stuff. So it's hard for me to try and use them as a example of socialism and try to fit that into an argument since I think they're capitalists.
Mhm. Well, I guess so I guess what I would just say is that when it comes to the Nordics not being socialist, I mean, I don't think they have to be socialist for them to sort of fit in an argument for socialist. All I claimed is that on your theory, or on if your argument were accurate, it seems like what we should expect is that when countries move more in the direction that I'm talking about, they start to see drastically less, business startups and so on. But it just seems like we don't see that. Countries move in the direction that I'm talking about, they become more successful. Now, it's still possible that there's some sort of bell curve where, like, they become more successful when they move more towards socialism. But if they moved even further, then they would just, like, collapse, or they would start to see diminishing returns. Now, I guess I
Yeah, I
would
think
just
that would
need
be
some argument
closer.
as to
I think that'd be
why.
closer to what I'm arguing, since I'm saying that the middle ground, the bell curve of the mixed economy, that is the capitalism I'm arguing for, not laissez-faire capitalism. So I think that what you said would be a closer characterization to what I'm arguing for, where it's like we're in the middle of the bell curve, and if we go more towards socialism, we'll see bad effects. Because I'm not on the laissez-faire side, I'm more the mixed economy side. So I think that way is a better way to understand the argument.
Sure. So, I mean, so I would just say that, you know, if we go more in the direction of socialism, and it seems to be working, um, the like if we go in the direction of some particular model, some particular system, and the benefits that I am associating with that system, or that I'm proposing that system might have, are borne out, and the worries that many people have about those sorts of systems aren't borne out, then it seems like the most simple way to interpret that. It seems like it seems like if you were to add in the extra assumption, sure, moving in the direction of your system has worked so far, but if we went even further, it would be a disaster. If you wanted to justify that, that doesn't seem like the most plausible interpretation of the data, just sort of pre-theoretically. So you would have to provide some sort of like argument or empirical evidence as to why it's the case that going further would cause these disastrous effects that haven't been seen or that haven't been really borne out so far up to this point.
Well, we have seen those in many socialist countries that do take a significant more portion of the companies, like Russia and Venezuela and Cuba, what's his name. So we have seen that when they take a large control of the company or of the country, we do see significantly negative downsides to that all the time when the governments take majority shareholder control of all of the means of production. In every case, I think in history that's ever happened, we see a bad effect of that, which is why the Norwegian countries don't do it. They have a limit on this. They say mixed economy is good. We like mixed economy. That's why they say we're not a socialist company, because they want to limit that because of all of the negative side effects of the government taking the majority shareholder of the means of production, which is, I think, in every example in history had a hugely negative outcome.
So I would say that I don't actually buy the sort of factual premise. So, like, for example, some of the examples that you point to, like Venezuela. I mean, even at the height of Hugo Chavez's welfare state, like the percentage of employees that were employed by the government were like lower than that of France. I mean, if you want to compare like Venezuela and Norway, one interesting way to do it is both Norway and Venezuela, one of the main elements of their economy is that they're largely propped up by their oil sectors. And so we can look at how they use their oil money, or at least they have, large natural oil reserves that benefits their economy. Not largely, it's not like their economies couldn't function without it. But it's a huge element. And so if you look at how Norway and Venezuela comparatively approach their oil sectors, Venezuela basically has nationalized their oil sector, and then they use the money that their oil sector makes to basically fund current government spending. Norway, on the other hand, uses that oil money to establish a collectively held capital stock, and then the returns on that capital stock, on that social wealth fund, go to fund current social spending. And so insofar as socialism is about collective ownership of capital and things like that, then it seems that, when we look at the ways that they approach their oil sectors, Norway comes out as far more socialist than Venezuela. And this also holds true when you compare like their rates of taxation and social spending and so on.
Wait, I'm not following this. So like, how much of the GDP did Venezuela's government own? The GDP income is 90-something%, because it got it all from oil. The other companies weren't making much money. Pretty much the entire GDP of Venezuela came from oil, and that's why the government only took that. Even if there was like the percentage of employees or whatever, it doesn't matter here. They owned 90-something% of the means of GDP production in the country. So that's a lot more than.
Can you wait?
Think so.
Where are you getting the statistic from?
From when I read about this a while ago. What was Venezuela's oil percent of GDP? %95 of exports. That's today. I don't care about today.
Well, yeah. Well, if we're looking at the percentage of exports that are made up by oil,
how much did oil contribute to Venezuela's GDP? Petroleum contributes 80% of Venezuela's exports with value of $22 billion. That's 2017. That's not Chavez. God damn it. I'll have to find it. It's going to take too long just to Google it.
Okay. Well, I mean, even if we're talking about the extent of the GDP, which is, due to their oil resources, I don't think that's exactly what we're looking for when we're trying to figure out how much of the GDP is owned by the state. I mean, those are different metrics. But I mean, even if we went to like 90%, there still wouldn't even be a big difference between Venezuela and Norway in that respect. I mean, Venezuela, in Norway, at least of 2012, and this has only gone up since then, by the way, the value of state-owned enterprises as a percentage of GDP in Norway was 88%, and that's only risen since 2012. But I mean, even granting that Venezuela was like this socialist state, and I don't really think it is. I think it's, if anything, less socialist generally than the Nordics. I mean, even granting that, right? I mean, I take it that when we look at the causes of Venezuela's economic collapse, the story was something like there was a glut in oil production, or there was, I think, like Saudi Arabia ramped up oil production in like 2014, and then there was a glut in the Venezuelan economy, which was largely dependent on oil exports. And then in order to get themselves out of that edgy situation, the Venezuelan government started rapidly and excessively printing money. And that excessive money printing essentially created rapid inflation, hyperinflation. And so I don't know how much that has to do with socialism, insofar as I don't think socialism on any typical or orthodox definition has much to do with the rate at which we print money or the extent to which we make our economy dependent on oil exports. It just seems like the factors that were relevant there didn't really have much to do with socialism.
So one of the arguments is that because of the lack of diversity in types of companies that are made, because of the lack of creation rate and the lack of the survivability and the lack of the income that people get from making companies, you get a much less diverse amount of companies, which creates, since it's kind of like evolution, you just get a bunch of random mutations, and some of them do really well and some of them don't. Because of the lack of diversity in companies, you get less a diversified economy. And that's one of the consequences of socialism that we also see in other countries that espouse socialism, the CCP and other Eastern countries that espouse socialism. We see much less diverse kinds of companies being made, which leads to the fact of focusing on more one specific type of industry, like oil or whatever. That is one of the economic consequences of socialism in the economics papers.
I don't know if Norway's
well, they're not socialists,
I mean,
so
yeah, I mean, I don't know if like, so I mean, Norway, for example, could have been, which also has a very high business rate, startup rate, could have been hit just as hard as Venezuela in the face of, in the face of the ramping up of oil production. But the reason that Norway didn't, face the same negative consequences as Venezuela is because Norway was able to ride out the oil price drop with less devastation, because it used its oil surplus to build a huge capital fund rather than current social spending. And so when that surplus evaporates due to an oil price drop, Norway doesn't face any immediate crisis and can even draw down the capital fund as it did to fill the temporary gap. And so had Venezuela managed its oil sector just like Norway did, then we wouldn't be talking about Venezuela's economic collapse. And so it seems like even with decreases in startups and so on, the real reason Norway failed was because it didn't manage its oil sector in the way it could have. And if it would have managed it in a more socialist way, in the way
you
that Norway does.
You said Norway failed.
Oh yeah, I meant to say Venezuela. Yeah, I hope that was clear. That point came out a little jumbled, but yeah, I hope I made myself clear with what I was trying to get at there.
Yep. All right, so we've been talking for about an hour on that one. Let's switch over to morality. You said somebody suggested something about it.
Oh yeah, somebody told me that you had thoughts on moral realism.
Yeah.
yeah, I think we probably have differing perspectives there. So, I guess what's your basic view on meta ethics and moral realism?
Yeah, I'm definitely a moral realist. I think that I don't think there's any like hard evidence for it. I think I'm just looking at the patterns in moral intuition and moral progress, and I see a pattern there, and I think that a pattern would apply to other species if we found them, other aliens, AIs, whatever we discover, other organisms of life in the universe. And if that's the case, then this pattern is something more than just an evolutionary byproduct of social conditioning. So there must be some other thing causing this emergent pattern cross species on the planet or on the universe. And so I think that will be the case. I think we're going to discover that there is this consistent pattern of some kind of moral inclination in all minds all throughout the universe. And so I think it's more of a higher order emergent property than a social thing. And so I do believe there is a moral realism, and I think the best description of that would be any involuntary imposition of will is immoral. That would be the principle to try to describe what I think that higher order emergent property would be.
Okay, so your view is that there's some sort of pattern such that, when cultures evolve, maybe economically to a certain point, they tend to come around to some certain moral view.
Yep. Intellectually
Okay.
and economically, yeah.
Okay, and so my first question would be, what makes you think that the involuntary imposition of will moral framework that you talked about, what makes you think that that's the end point, right? Why wouldn't it be that, as we keep evolving into more and more Star Trek territory, we might just have completely different more norms that are nothing like what you described. Like just because we are currently at our most developed point compared to where we've ever been in the past, and these are the norms we hold, that doesn't mean that we'll still hold these norms when we develop even further. I guess I'm not sure why we would assume that.
Based on the patterns in moral progress, it seems like as we gain more resources, that the scope of our moral intuitions expands. So, like, it goes from starting with back when we were hunter gatherers, the most important people in the tribe are the ones that are valuable. And then as we gain agriculture and other things, we say, oh, well, the poor people, they matter too. And then as we keep going, women matter and slaves matter. And then we go to veganism, vegan animals matter. It seems like the progress we make is going in a consistent pattern, not like in a random pattern. And it seems like as we gain more resources, our feelings are that more things, more consciousnesses matter than before. And so if we continue to follow that pattern, it goes in a very specific direction to all of the consciousnesses matter. And that seems to be the conclusion that we would lead to if this pattern continues.
Yeah, that could be the case. I'm not so sure. So I guess I'll just say what my view is. So I agree with you that there seems to be certain trajectories, right? So there seems to be a trajectory in the direction of sort of expanding our moral circle over time. And I think that there might be good sort of sociological explanations for that. So, for example, um, as the, so let's say when we're sort of hunter gatherers or we're working in very small tribes, it's not really functional to have moral consideration for everyone, right? You only need to have moral consideration for your tribe because you live in a tribe, right? Whereas as the world becomes more globalized and more cooperative, it seems to be it starts to become more functional for people to have broader moral consideration.
What do you mean by
And
functional? Like benefit the culture or something?
like it benefits it benefits society to have those norms in order to cooperate in the ways that we want to be able to cooperate in for economic gains and so on,
Would you still
and
apply that to
material
like
gains.
veganism? Like would you consider veganism to be a functional moral belief?
I think that so not really, but I think that basically veganism is sort of driven by a few things. I mean, for one, in more recent cultures, We tend to portray animals in a way that's more like we keep them as pets and so on. And so people just sort of naturally grew a sympathy to animals. And then in addition to that, a lot of people's motivation for veganism is something like, the old argument that like Peter Singer makes, where it's like, hey, we want to have sympathy for all humans, and it's not sure how we could have a principled way for having sympathy for all humans, but not animals. Um, but I mean, so not everything is going to be like directly, functionally explained in a very narrow way. But I guess what I'm trying to say is just that I think we can explain the pattern by saying something like, um, so I agree with you. I don't think that our moral intuitions or anything like that come from like evolution, right? I think there's too much moral variation for that to make sense. So like, there are tribes where like it's just accepted to hunt people for sport or to like eat people and so on. And so it doesn't seem like morality is a trait where like we have these specific moral norms that we all just naturally have, because we don't observe that cross culturally. And so my explanation would be that all humans have certain faculties. We have like perspective taking faculties. We have some sort of base layer of non-moral emotions. We have meta emotions, so we can feel emotions about the emotions that we feel. And we also have like non-moral just inclinations and drives towards and against certain things, which can sometimes be translated into moral inclinations. So for example, we might have an evolutionarily derived disgust factor against incest, and then with some conditioning we can transform that into like a moral disposition against incest. And so I think we all have those faculties. And also, all societies face certain problems, certain coordination problems. All societies need to ensure stability and ensure cooperation and have people get along and cooperate with one another. And because all cultures face this universal problem, and all people have these innate tools that can be manipulated to form moral norms, all cultures face an incentive to manipulate and emotionally condition people in such a way, such that they form moral intuitions and moral norms. And that's why the moral norms different people have are going to differ based on which culture they were inculcated by. And I think that also explains the sort of variation that you're, or the sort of pattern that you're talking about, because as the conditions under which cultures are operating change and start to converge, as all countries become more wealthy, we would expect that there's a predictable pattern in what sort of norms are inculcated into people, because those norms are inculcated based on the conditions that the cultures face in the world. And so I guess that seems like a fine explanation for the pattern you're talking about to me. And I guess if you wanted to postulate something like irreducibly normative or, like ontologically weighty and robust, I guess I would need some sort of justification for why we should invoke a less sort of qualitatively parsimonious explanation when it seems like there are more qualitatively parsimonious explanations available.
Right. So the problems I would have with your view are twofold. One is that we see morality in animals, that and these morality that we see in animals and other groups that aren't connected as they have developed. And there are different societies like American Indian versus Australian or versus Chinese prior to any kind of world traveling where they were completely separate from one another. They still follow the same patterns in morality to some extent. So it would make sense that if they were all intermingling in some way, that your model is that they would intermingle and then conjoin social norms. That would explain it. But if we don't see that, if we see they're completely separate, and still converge on the same social norms, that means that the social norms are something outside of simply the social conditioning, since they're not getting them from other cultures, they're getting them from something more fundamental, because they can't be getting them if they're not from other cultures, if they don't mix with the other cultures. And because we do see it in animals who are the same way, separate cultures essentially also developing the same kind of precursors of morality, it seems more inclined that it's something more fundamental.
So I guess we can start with the, moral precursors in animals thing. So what do you think are those moral, like, why do you think animals have some sort of proto-morality? Because I think I would actually contest that. I'm not convinced that their animals actually do have proto-morality.
Well, like some of the examples of the Capuchin monkeys who were given the food berry thingies, and if they were unfairly given the food berry thingies, they would not even take the ones they were given and they'd throw them back. Like if you gave three to the monkey on the left and you gave one to the monkey on the right, the monkey on the right would get pissed if they were given a job and they had to do a job and get paid. And if you underpaid one of the monkeys, they get pissed and throw it back at you instead of eating it. And the some of the other monkeys would share and be like, "Oh yeah, I was given more, and this is unfair." And they'd recognize this unfairness value and share and try to build cooperative relationships with one another that seem to mirror our morality in some sense.
Um, yeah, so wait, so was the second point that they basically can be so the first point was that they seem to respond to inequity, and the second point was that they seem to have some sort of reciprocity norms.
Yes, essentially
Okay.
what morality is, more or less.
Okay, got you. So I have a few, so I'm somewhat familiar with what you're referring to. I have a few issues with that sort of interpretation of the studies that you're mentioning. So firstly, um, in the studies that you're talking about, it doesn't seem to be the case that monkeys would be responding to inequity, right? Because the way I remember the study being was um, basically they trained monkeys to some researchers trained monkeys to exchange like discs with experimenters for a food reward, and some monkeys received cucumbers as the reward and others received grapes. And some of the monkeys performing the task could see what another monkey was receiving, and the researchers found that monkeys who received cucumbers were willing to perform the task when they did not see what other monkeys were getting, but they were significantly more likely to reject the food reward when they witnessed another monkey getting a grape for equal work. Um, and so I guess my problem with the interpretation that you mentioned is that um, firstly, it doesn't seem to be the case that monkeys could be responding to inequity, because by refusing to take the cucumber, they actually increase inequity rather than reducing it, right? Human beings, on the other hand, who have a sense of fairness, will accept inequitable pay if they have no reason to think that rejecting the pay will have any impact on those who are receiving more,
Well, I'm
right?
not
And so
following the argument there. So, like, the response to inequity doesn't have to be like a rational response. So, if you see inequity and think this is bad, and then have like an emotional outburst that makes it more unequal, I don't think that's you could say that because the emotional outburst made it more unequal, it wasn't therefore a response to inequity. It still seems to be a response to inequity.
it just seems like this response isn't what we would expect if what they were outraged about was the inequity. Because we can see in humans that when humans are outraged by inequity, they'll still take the pay that they're given, even unless they have some reason to think that rejecting the pay will have an impact on the people who are receiving more, right? And so it seems like the way humans act when we're outraged by inequity and the way that we would expect monkeys to react when they are outraged by inequity isn't the way that the monkeys actually acted. And so I think that, and another important thing to note here is that it's also been pointed out that in the same study and in similar studies, cucumber receiving monkeys also refuse rewards in a control condition in which they see grapes being placed in a pile nearby rather than seeing the grapes being given to another monkey, which seems to suggest that it's not the case that monkeys have a sense of fairness, but rather that monkeys will turn down mediocre rewards when something better is in view. And this is a well-known occurrence in humans and monkeys. And so it doesn't seem like this is best explained by appealing to monkeys having a sense of fairness.
I still think it does. So, like the studies by Franz Walsh, this is a fairly consistent thing. Like the fact that it can also happen in other cases doesn't diminish that it also happens in this case, specifically related to fairness. So I think
Well,
that
well, it shows that the appealing to their outrage over fairness isn't necessary at all to explain the reaction. It seems like they would have had the reaction even if there were no perceived unfairness involved. It seems like the important thing is the monkeys are seeing, oh, there's a grape over there. I like the grape more than the cucumber, so I'm not going to take the cucumber. And they have that reaction whether the grape is just placed in a random pile or whether it's given to another monkey. And so it doesn't seem like uh like when we know that the reaction we're observing from the monkeys would be equally expected whether or not there was something involved that we perceive as an unfairness, goes to show that the fact that they had this reaction can't be evidence that they were reacting to unfairness, right? They would have had it regardless.
sure if those were at the same rate, but the studies I've seen, they're not at the same rate. There's a disproportionate rate to the amount that they're upset when it's given to another monkey versus just sitting on the table nearby. The fact that they do occasionally do it if it's sitting on the table nearby doesn't show that there's no correlation to the fairness metric of it giving to another monkey for doing the same amount of work.
I don't think that was, I mean, in the study that we're talking about, by
Franz de Waal?
Sarah Bronson and Franz de Waal, I don't think there was any difference in the rates in the reaction of the monkeys between when it was placed in a pile versus when it was given to other monkeys. And so, I mean, I guess if you want to prove me wrong on that, you could pull it up. But yeah, I mean, I don't think there was any noted difference there in the study. But and then I mean, with respect to the other thing that was talked about, because that is also, I mean, if you could establish the point about reciprocity, then my point here would essentially be moot. And I mean, there have been sort of attempts to study like reciprocity norms in monkeys. So, for example, there was a study titled, I think this is probably the one you're referencing, is very famous. It was titled "Giving Unto Others Genetically Unrelated Cotton Top Tamarin Monkeys Preferentially Give Food to Those Who Altruistically Give Food Back." And according to this study, basically there's a few things. One, monkeys will not give food to other monkeys who do not give them food. B, monkeys will give food to other monkeys from whom they have received food, but monkeys will reciprocate only if the monkeys who gave them food did not do so as a byproduct of selfish actions. And so it's worth noting, first of all, that if the authors can establish the final point that monkeys will reciprocate only if the monkeys who gave them food didn't do so as a byproduct of selfish actions, then their case basically falls apart, right? Because if it's merely the case that monkeys give food to other monkeys who give them food, then we could explain this behavior as a conditioned response, right? So the non-nativist could just say, look, if a monkey is by chance given food by another monkey and then by chance gives food in return, the first monkey's generous behavior will be positively reinforced, and that monkey will be likely the next time around. And if this is how it happens, then it seems as though patterns of reciprocal giving emerge through conditioning rather than being innate. And so you really would need to substantiate the final point in order for the case to work. But I think that there's a plausible explanation for the final point, that a plausible explanation that fits into the picture that I'm providing for why it is the case that monkeys will reciprocate only if the monkeys who gave them food didn't do so as a byproduct of selfish actions, which is that if we assume that the prior behavior is due to conditioning, which is basically my explanation, then we would think that monkeys will give food to each other if doing so has been positively reinforced in the past, right? And in order for positive reinforcement to take place, a monkey who gives food must receive food afterwards, and reinforcement can only work if the monkey thinks that the reward she's receiving is a consequence of her behavior. And so it follows that if a monkey receives a reward that would have come about no matter what, the monkey will not interpret the reward as contingent on her own behavior. And so I basically think that there are, when you look at the details of the studies that you're referencing, I mean, there are fine explanations that don't appeal to the existence of some sort of proto-morality in animals.
Yeah, I don't see that very much at all. So like I see that in many species they have like inbuilt biological desires, like the cuckoo bird like sees eggs and it pushes out of the nest as soon as it's born or whatever. And this pattern that this reciprocity pattern seems to be consistent across species and across social groups. Like even bats do the same thing. The mother bat will give blood and feed the kids of others that have shared their blood or whatever. And so it seems like this pattern isn't just social conditioning, because it does happen in a great deal of species that are completely separated from one another. And so it makes no sense that they would all in the same way be social conditioned in the same way, especially if you like create a new group of monkeys who haven't been social conditioned. Why do they adopt the same pattern? It seems like it's more likely an inbuilt evolutionary thing, rather because their desires and emotions lead to this kind of behavior, rather than it simply being a social construction. Because if it was simply social construction, you'd expect it wouldn't be present in all of the monkeys. There'd be some that they wouldn't do this. You wouldn't see this for some reason, but it seems to be pretty consistent in all social species. It's always there.
Right. Well, I think I tried to speak against that, which is just to say I don't think it's been substantiated that, for example, monkeys actually have moral reciprocation norms. That's not to say that animals don't act sometimes in ways that basically reflect, like something that we would call reciprocal behavior if it were to happen in humans. But that's different from actually having inborn like moral norms and moral intuitions that like reciprocation is good, and like blameworthy if someone doesn't do it, or praiseworthy if someone does do it. And I consider those to be basically necessary conditions of
Wait,
actually
go back to
having.
that. So like to me, if they get dopamine rewards for this kinds of interactions, that seems to be the same precursor to morality, regardless of whether or not they realize someone is blameworthy or not blameworthy.
Yeah, I don't think so. So, for example, like you mentioned, like the example of bats, right? What was the example of bats being reciprocal that you gave?
Yeah, they take blood and they share the blood with the kids of the other bats' kids, and if they do, then the other bats will share their blood with their kids. But if one of the mother bats doesn't share blood with other kids or whatever, then no one shares it with theirs, or they kick them out of the cave or something along those lines. I forget what it was exactly.
Okay, yeah. So, I mean, I think that that's basically, um, I think that that's open to the same explanation I gave in the monkey case. Um, and so, and so I would say that if we just have, and so another example, right?
Oops.
And so, sorry, what'd you say?
I accidentally muted you on my stream. That was my bad.
Oh, okay. No
I tried
worries.
to mute myself because I had a little thing I was shaving off. So
Oh, okay. Yeah, no worries. So I think that, you know, uh, so some examples of moral norms in animals. So one would be reciprocity, and I think I gave an explanation that applies to the monkey case and the bat case, um, with respect to why animals might do that, because they view um, certain rewards as contingent upon certain behaviors, and so they engage in those behaviors. And similarly, like people point to the fact that animals are distressed when they see other animals in distress, and they say that's a moral norm. I don't really think that that's a moral norm either. So for example, the explanation I would give for something like that is that it's unsurprising that seeing a member of your species in distress or in pain would cause you distress, because it's a signal of danger, in the same way that like seeing like bushes rustle is a sign of danger, right? The fact that a member of your species is screaming or acting like they're in pain should indicate to you that there's danger nearby, and that should cause vicarious distress. But I don't think that I don't think that that makes it a moral norm. I think that in order for something to be a moral norm or a moral attitude, there has to be at least some emotions that you have, such that in order to have a moral attitude against an action, you would have to deem it blameworthy if someone else did the action or if you did the action, and praiseworthy when they don't do it. And you would have to deem it like you would have to have some sense of shame or guilt if you do it, or some sense of like anger or remorse if other, or not remorse, but like anger or disgust if other people do it. And so there has to be these self and other directed emotions of praise and blame in order for it to be a moral attitude. But just the fact that monkeys will, or other animals will engage in like reciprocal behavior or vicarious distress, for reasons that are unrelated to what we think of as morality, for maybe practical reasons or for biological reasons, I don't think that that serves to show that they have anything like a proto-morality, I guess.
Yeah, so I think I understand your position more, and I would just disagree that morality entails this need of feeling blameworthy or praiseworthy. Like, I'd see those as consequences of the biological feelings we already had. Kind of like you said, that we have this ability to associate things with our emotional reflexivity, where we can have emotions about our emotions. And so we apply those feelings after the fact. I don't think morality is, in essence, blameworthiness or praiseworthiness. I think blameworthiness and praiseworthiness are things we humans have applied to our moral inclinations. And so I would say that, in essence, our morality is the emotional responses we get to these kinds of actions, which are inbuilt, and then we apply these blameworthiness, praiseworthiness labels to those things. But the emotions themselves, I think, are the essence of morality, not the secondary things we've added on.
Well, so I mean, think about it this way. So like, would you accept that something like animals being distressed when they see other animals in distress, would you think that that's kind of like a moral thing?
Possibly, maybe. I think so.
Okay, so I would just say that like, um, so I would just say that like, if we imagined a person who, when he sees other people in other people in pain, he has he has some sort of reaction, like he has like some sort of he's stressed out by seeing other people in pain. But he's not particularly like, if someone were to say, hey dude, I'm gonna like press a button that wipes out this galaxy of people, but you won't have to witness it, or something like that, and then they pushed the button and everyone died, and this person just like, he has distress when he sees other people in pain, but he doesn't consider it blameworthy to cause pain to other people, and he wouldn't really feel remorse if he caused pain to other people. um I mean, intuitively that just doesn't really feel a moral like a moral disposition, just the fact that you act in certain ways. And the same thing with like reciprocity, like um, the fact that someone might engage in reciprocal behavior because it has a functional role, or because you perceive it as having some functional role, but you don't really think it's like praiseworthy to engage in reciprocal behavior, or you don't think it's blameworthy not to. It's just something you do for functional reasons. I don't think that that would really be a moral disposition either. I do think that those things are necessary for morality. And I would also think that um, if all you mean by a moral disposition is just things like vicarious distress, or these like non-blame or praiseworthy involving like base emotions that we're both referring to, that play into the explanation for why animals feel vicarious distress or engage in reciprocal behavior, um, then it seems like the explanations for those things don't have to invoke moral realism at all. I mean, it just seems like if you want an explanation, if all you need is an explanation for why most species experience vicarious distress when other members of those species are in pain, then I mean, it's just obvious, right? It's a sign of danger. So it's evolutionarily advantageous for them to be distressed when they see another member of their species in distress.
Right. So, but I would think that because those patterns are consistent across all species, and that it's the fact that you can have different feelings of an individual, and that they would separate the feeling of pressing a button and killing a species or whatever, and the idea of seeing someone suffering causing them to feel some kind of disgust or whatever wouldn't be contradictory to the pattern as a whole. So if the reason the vast majority of people think it's blameworthy to press the button is because they got this evolutionary tendency to feel disgust and one person doesn't, that wouldn't show that morality was not caused by this overall feeling, this biological feeling. It just shows that there's one offshoot where this guy has a strange biological wiring in his brain. And I would say even in that case, it's most likely that if seeing suffering causes him distress, thinking about suffering would also cause distress because the same part of the brain would light up. And so if he imagines the people who he presses the button in distress, he would probably still feel some kind of distress from that. It just wouldn't be as significant because of some miswiring in the brain, but the overall pattern would still be the same. It would still be the case that this feeling of disgust led to this consideration that it's blameworthy or praiseworthy later on in the majority of the species, even if one person doesn't do that. So I'd still say that morality is, in essence, the precursors to those things. I don't think morality was generated by the concepts of blameworthiness and praiseworthiness. I think those are a consequence of morality, not what morality is.
So my view of morality isn't that. That's just what morality is. My view of morality is that self-directed and other directed emotions involving things like blame and praise are necessary conditions for morality, but that's not like the whole story. So like I said, I think we have a variety of capacities. So capacities like vicarious distress, the capacity to feel vicarious distress, and maybe certain inclinations we have towards acting in certain ways because it was evolutionary advantageous, like incest being a good example. We're all inclined to sort of be grossed out by incest because, you know, it's bad for the genetic pool for people to be reproducing with their families. And so we have these sorts of innate inclinations and innate emotions and reactions to certain things. We have the ability to do perspective taking. We have the ability to engage in like meta emotions. And morality arises when cultures basically tap into those capacities and manipulate them in ways such that practices of blame and praise are generated from them. And so I think that's basically my story. But if you're basically just saying, so I mean, I agree with you that the fact that, you know, some people might not have some of these capacities doesn't dispute the fact that there are general, you know, patterns, general regularities. It seems like most people have these capacities, um, in most animal species. But like, if your story is just appealing to these sort of base faculties, like the ability to experience vicarious distress and, you know, maybe certain pressures some people have to reciprocate, then my point would just be it no longer seems like invoking moral realism is necessary to explain that pattern. Like there are very good evolutionary reasons why we would expect most animals to have things like the ability to experience vicarious distress. And so I just don't know why we're bringing in moral realism to explain this data when it seems like by your own lights. I mean, I think you even referred to it as evolutionary, so a lot of these capacities. And so if these capacities are all morality is, and it seems like there's very good evolutionary explanations for these capacities, then, you know, where's the explanatory role for morality?
Right, that's where I brought in the thing that I think we would find these same patterns in any species that we found across the universe, including those that didn't evolve. So like AIs or whatever are probably going to discover the same species. And as I mentioned, we haven't found this yet, but I think this is something we're likely to find as we grow and build AIs and discover other species potentially in the universe. This pattern will still hold the same. So that would be the reason I think that we would adopt moral realism. If we did find this pattern was consistent across species everywhere in the universe, including those that didn't evolve, that would be a good indication that it's more than just an evolutionary property, and especially more than what we need to show. It's not just a social property.
So I guess my question would be, if you think that things like experiencing vicarious distress, um, if that's like what you mean by like something like a moral attitude or an innate moral norm that we have. Um, so uh, if you, I mean, it seems like when explaining why these capacities um, are found in humans, why is the capacity for vicarious distress, why is that found in humans? It seems like there are very good and very sufficient naturalistic, evolutionary, non-moral realist explanations for that data. And now I agree with you that if we found these exact same norms in like AI and like all of these other things which never evolved, right? In which we can't apply the same explanation to, then that might point to, okay, well maybe there is something else that's causing this. That's not just evolutionary. Um, but I guess like if the data that if the data that we have is sufficiently explainable in a certain way, and that explanation would predict that these non-evolved species wouldn't have these capacities, then why would we grant the assumption that they would, right? Like it seems like your argument is relying on a potential data point when our best explanation for the existing data points would conclude that these potential data points you're alluding to wouldn't come to fruition.
That's how good prediction works. Yes, it is a prediction about the future that diverges from the current hypothesis. That's yes.
I don't think that's really how a good prediction works.
I'm not sure what you mean there. So, like, novel testable prediction is the ability to predict something new that isn't already expected by the current model, and that's how you have a new thing added to the theory.
So you think a good prediction is a prediction which isn't expected given our best explanations for all of the existing data?
Sort of, yes. Novel prediction.
Okay. Um,
Like general
I mean, I just
relativity predicting, what was it? That you could measure the light around the curvature around the sun in a new way that wasn't expected. That was good. That was a good prediction. Or the gravitational waves, seeing gravitational waves that space and time bend. That was a good prediction. No one expected.
yeah, I think that novel predictions are like good. Like it's good to make like, it's good to have a theory that makes testable predictions which aren't already established as true or false, right? I mean, I think, predictive fruitfulness is a theoretical virtue. But I think generally a good novel prediction is one where we're making a novel prediction because we think something about the existing established data gives us good reason to think that this prediction will be borne out. And if you can't provide a good reason for thinking this prediction will be borne out, I mean we could predict anything, right? I mean, I could predict that like tomorrow the sun will fall out of the universe or something, but like if we don't have good reason based on everything we know about physics to think that that will happen, then it doesn't. I don't know why we would take seriously a theory which predicts that.
I definitely wouldn't agree there. So, for example, to use the Bible, say the Bible said the world is 4.5 billion years old, the universe is 13.8 billion years old. DNA is a double helix, and said this all 6,000 years ago, and we had no reason to believe any of that given the physics. If we discover them to be right, that's a good reason to believe what the Bible says.
Right, but before discovering that those things are right, we wouldn't have good reason to believe in the Bible.
Right. So
And so
that's what I'm
until we
saying.
find the data that you're talking about, we don't have good reason to accept your theory.
Yeah, I said that at the very beginning. I don't have any strong evidence for this, but I think this is something we will discover.
Well, that's different from not having strong evidence. That's having no evidence. That's just saying, I have a theory that says that this thing might happen, and we have no reason to believe that it will happen. Literally nothing about our current best predictions about the existing data gives us reason to think that this will happen, but I'm just going to say that it might, and that's my theory. I mean, that doesn't seem like a good theory.
Well, I think it's pretty likely that this is going to happen. So
But why though?
that was a separate point here. So objecting to your definition of prediction, it seems like if you make predictions about things with no basis in physics to assume that they're going to be true, and they discover to be true, that's still evidence. That's still very good evidence. So,
But, yeah, of course, but the evidence doesn't come until we discover the things to be true.
I agree. So
I mean, that's my point is just like right now, like if your predictions were borne out, then your theory, we would have good reason to believe your theory. But
yeah, that's all I'm asking for. That's the full extent of my model right there. So yeah, I agree. There isn't any like strong evidence there for accepting it, and until we find the discovery. And if you think it's highly likely that you will discover this, then you have a reason to accept the model.
Okay. I mean, yeah, well, but my point would be, I agree that if we found these things, we would have good reason to accept the model. And I agree that it's possible that we could find these things. But my point is just based on all of the currently existing data, I don't think we have any good reason to think that we will find these things. And so based on our current epistemic standpoint, I think we don't have good reason to think that these predictions will be borne out, and therefore we don't have good reasons to believe your theory.
That's fair enough. So I'm happy with that, as long as you grant the part that it is a prediction, and if it comes true, that is good evidence of my model. That's the only part of I'm arguing for with my model of moral realism. I'm obviously not saying I've already have strong evidence, because then I'd have a Nobel Prize. So I have to wait for that one.
Sure. Okay.
So yeah, we've been going for about 2 hours. Was really great talking to you. Appreciate you coming on. Do you want to give a shout out to your channel? People can find you again.
Yeah, my channel is called Mouthy Infidel. I'm trying to upload more. I haven't uploaded in a while, but I try to talk about like politics and philosophy. Yeah, it was nice talking to you. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. I'll talk to you later. And you can just close the screen. I'm going to start the after show.
Okay, see ya.
See ya. I already have a Discord up. Discord. What do we got? People. We got people in the chats. Lounge VC.
Well, that's nice.
Lounge wow. VC. What's up,
TJ? Hey, Simon. How's it going?
Not bad. What you got going on?
Just finished the show. https://discord.io/tjump.
Are you doing an after show or no?
Yep. I'm just going to stay in here, though, because I'm lazy.
All right. There it is. So I'm going to mute up so I don't get recorded.
Yep.
Yeah.
We're recording Simon.
Hey, we are here to record Simon.
I missed most of the stream. What was the guy's argument?
For which thing? We talked about socialism and capitalism and morality.
About the morality, he was bringing experimental data, like what the chimpanzees or the monkeys were.
He said that was fully explained by social conditioning and didn't have an evolutionary basis.
And that's what he needed, an evolutionary basis? Or?
Oh, no, I argued that it was an evolutionary basis because I was arguing for moral realism. So he said even if we grant it has an evolutionary basis, that still wouldn't lead to moral realism.
Gotcha. Okay. And what do you think of that guy? Is he smart, or was he?
Yeah, I guess so. He's smarter than Kent Hovind for sure.
Sets that bar real high, T-Jump. Yeah.
Yeah, he's a pretty smart guy.
See, the thing with morality, like I given up trying to look for the holy grail of morality, right? It's like we're presupposing that we're in a simulation and the coder programmed some objective morality. We're presupposing that, and we don't know what it is. But I think we're in prime reality, and we just have to kind of like subjectively find something that works given the conditions.
Well, like if there was a coder, like a grand coder in the universe, and he put like a code that makes us all moral, that would still kind of be like an objective morality. It'd be like there is some fundamental part of the universe that's been programmed into us.
Exactly right. Like we are presupposing that there is one, and we just don't know what he coded, right? But I think that...
I wouldn't say presupposing. I'd say that it's a conclusion based on the evidence. So if we see the patterns in moral intuition and moral progress, it seems like there's something like that guiding morality.
If that was the case, what would the answer to the Euthyphro dilemma would be? What would it be in that case, right? If there's some encoder.
So yeah. In this case, it's hypothetically the case that we're in a program, and it seems like there's some program. In that case, it wouldn't be objective, but it would still have the same. It would look like it's objective. It looked like there's some pattern in the universe causing us to feel this thing. Really, it's just a program in a computer, and there's nothing above that, so it wouldn't be objective. It would be subjective because it would be contingent on the whims of the programmer. And so, but if it was the case that there was a programmer who did this and it was subjective, it would have the same consequence of having us all share these beliefs, and so it would look like it was a law of physics and look like it was objective from our perspective.
Could you have the programmer just be the sort of the environment that we find ourselves in? The natural laws, basically.
Sort of. I mean, I think that would be the program. But yes, you could say that if there's like some law of physics that was either fundamental to reality or a product of other things that are fundamental in reality, then yes, it could be sort of analogous to the programmer. But then in that case, I still think that would be objective, though, because I think for it to be subjective, it would have to be contingent on the programmer's mind in some case. If it's just a law that emerges from physics, that would still, I think, be objective.
Yeah. Can I ask you
what? Uda, you cut out. What was your question?
Sorry. Can you hear me okay, or do I need to redo my...
Go ahead, just ask your question. I'll let you know if I can't understand it.
Okay, so do you think that if I concluded that magical leprechauns that existed and were invisible and they had mass but we couldn't see them were the majority of what exists in the universe, and then when we go to measure the way that galaxies are spinning, we see that they're spinning faster than what we would predict based on the amount of mass that we can see in the universe? Is that good evidence of my magical leprechaun model?
If you predicted it before we knew, yes, it would be some evidence. Like because if you predicted, like if you said, I believe that there are magical leprechauns and these magical leprechauns are going to increase the mass of universes, and then I'm going to predict that, well, once we look out in the universes, we'll see that they're actually rotating faster than what we would expect without the magical leprechauns. And we then discovered that would then be evidence of your model. I don't think it would be sufficient, but it would be a piece of evidence for your model.
It'd be really weak evidence, don't you think? Because wouldn't stronger evidence be the model that there's something that we can't see and we don't know what it is?
Well, that would be the conclusion of if we saw it. But if you made a prediction before we saw it, that would be evidence of what you're saying is there.
So this is where I disagree, because I think that if you don't have a working model, then just your prediction can literally be the result of pure chance. It can be the result of, it could, like, you bring this up with the Hindu scripture a lot.
Yep.
And it's not good evidence, because if you can't explain why your prediction works, then why would it be even plausibly true? Other than just you happen to get it right. Two things
there. One is that the Hindus do explain why it works. Their God created the universe. That's why it works. But if I agree, one prediction isn't very good. It's something, but it's not very good. But if there were dozens of these accurate predictions in holy texts, that would be good evidence. Like if it made a lot of them and they were right, that would be good evidence to believe the holy text. So one prediction would be some evidence, but it wouldn't be sufficient. But it would definitely be evidence. And I don't think, the problem with what you're saying is, if we accept that as true, it undermines all of science because of the problem of underdetermination. It's possible that Einstein's general theory of relativity just happened to make the predictions by luck, and it's actually magical leprechauns. Magical leprechauns are really what's causing the space-time to bend and the mass of the galaxies to be increased to cause the speed of rotation to be increased. And we think general relativity is right because it matches the other things that we see, or the other prior theories that we had that were also just happened to be lucky descriptions of how the leprechauns operate or something. So the fact that it could simply be by luck doesn't mean that it isn't evidence of that model for it to make successful predictions. So like it's possible that all of the evidence we have is just lucky and that it's all wrong, but it's still evidence that it's correct, even though it could be wrong. So the fact that if you make successful predictions before we know them is evidence it's correct, even though it could have just been luck. And the more predictions you make successfully, the more evidence you have.
About the model, I think that the Hindu side trading everything is a model, but it's really maybe a very small part of a model. I guess I haven't, considered how far you could break what a model is down into, infinitely small components. But I would just think that if you can't explain anything about why your prediction was predicted, why did you make this prediction, then it's more likely that you just got lucky than if you can explain your work. It's kind of like if you have a multiple choice test, and you have 4 answers, and you just bubble one in and you get it right. But when it says show your work on the side, the reason is because you need to show that you understand the model. That shows you actually are correct. You're not just guessing.
Right. I kind of agree there, but I'm not seeing how saying God did it wouldn't be showing your work in that case. Like if you believe in magical leprechauns and you think magical leprechauns are just hanging out in universes adding mass, that would be an explanation. That's showing your work. Like here's the thing causing the thing. Like if you said, I predict that we're going to see universes are spinning faster than they should, but I don't know why. I mean, that's obviously not a model, but if you posit any reason to why it's happening, then it becomes a model. You're saying this is the cause of the thing.
But so like right now, physicists like did discover that. I mean, maybe they didn't predict it. Maybe they discovered it, but the fact is they don't know what it is. And so the strongest model right now is an X factor. It's a variable and it's just an unknown. And I can't think of any scientific thing where it's like, well, we predicted this and we can't explain why it's that way, but we predicted it and we were right, and now that's the prevailing model in science. I just don't think that's actually how science is done.
Well, I agree, because that's a contradiction. Like you can't say I predict something and have no explanation for it, and then have that be the super explanation. Well, actually, there is Copenhagen explanation is literally that, but if you have no explanation for something and predict the thing, it's like saying I predict the sun will turn purple next week on a Tuesday. Why? I don't know. That would be like making a prediction with no explanation. Saying, I predict the sun will turn purple next Tuesday because the God will do it. Well, that's now an explanation. That's now reason to believe the God is there if this occurs. So, I mean, I agree that simply positing a prediction and then not giving an explanation, no one could accept the non-explanation as being a model, because it's not an explanation. You're just saying something will happen and then it happens. Like, yes, but why? You need to know the why for it to be a model. But that why can be as simple as God did it. Like that's a legitimate why to build a model.
Well, I think that there are more likely, I mean, if you just break this down statistically, people guess things correctly, X percent of the time. So wouldn't there be some kind of scientific model that is accepted as correct with an scientific theory, or even just a hypothesis as considered correct with literally no explanation of how it got there, just based on a prediction and a model that doesn't explain it at all. I mean, I don't think
again,
that there are.
The point is a model that doesn't explain it at all means there is no explanation. Like saying God did it does explain it to some degree. So I agree that if a model literally explains nothing and says, here's what's going to happen, and then doesn't tell you why, you obviously can't believe why it happened because it doesn't say why it happened. But if it gives an explanation to why it happened, God done it, that is some explanatory power. It does explain things. It now gives us a reason to accept the things the text says is the cause. So that's the part I'm losing your argument here, is because saying God did it is an explanation. It is explaining the phenomenon. And I don't see why you keep saying it equating that to not having any explanation at all.
Well, because you can't explain how a God could have done it.
Well, I don't think that matters. Like, we can't explain how quantum mechanics works, but it still makes successful predictions.
I think that we do explain it to the degree that we can, and then everything else is an X factor. It's just like what I was saying about dark matter. Like, we can't explain what the dark matter is, so we don't call it a leprechaun. We just call it X, you know, because it's not. If someone were to have predicted that,
I think I see what you're saying. So, like, one example would be neutrinos. We've never directly observed neutrinos, but we've observed the consequences of neutrinos. We say, I think neutrinos have this mass and this speed, and when they hit this object, they'll create bubbles, and we see the bubbles, therefore neutrinos exist. So we believe in the neutrinos, even though we've never seen the neutrinos. We just see the consequences of the neutrinos. And the same thing would be here applied to the God. So even though we never see the God, we do see the consequences, which would be this expected result, the prediction that we expect to see. So we don't need to directly see the thing in the hypothesis, neutrinos or God, as long as we see the expected results. The universe created 4.5 billion years, or the world created 4.5 billion years ago, or whatever. If God exists, we would expect this set of facts to be true. This set of facts is true. Therefore, that's good evidence for God exists. Exactly the same as if neutrinos exist, we would expect these bubbles to be created. The bubbles are created, therefore neutrinos exist. So we don't need to directly see the existence of the thing we're positing, even in science.
Yeah, like we don't need to directly see dark matter, but we can't posit as anything other than dark matter, which basically translates to some unknown thing that works the same way math does, except we can't see it.
Well, that's why
we were to call it.
Well, the reason I use neutrinos. The reason I do use neutrinos is because we do say this is a neutrino. Here are the properties. Here's the spin, energy, mass it has. We can't see them at all, but we do say this is what it is. So the fact that we've never seen them, it's not like dark matter where we have no idea what it is. We say we know what neutrinos are. We know what the properties of them are, even though we've never seen them, because the predictions were made as if they have these properties, here's the effects we would expect to see, and then we see the effects. So we say, yes, they have these properties.
Well, yeah, but I would agree with that in the sense of neutrinos, because, right, I understand what you're saying. We can create a model that is perfectly giving us an image in that we can write on paper, even if we can't look at it with a microscope or something. I agree with that. All I'm saying is,
that's
like,
the same as the God.
That
would be the same as the God. So the God would be like the neutrino and saying, if God has these properties, he's the Hindu guy, Bhagavad Gita or whatever, I forget the name, Vishnu. If it's Vishnu and he is this guy with these properties, then what we expect to see is the world was created 4.5 billion years ago. And we do see it. That's evidence that Vishnu exists and he has these properties, in the same way that if we see the bubbles, it's evidence that neutrinos have these properties. We create a model with a set of properties and then an expected result of those properties. So that's different than dark matter, where we say, I don't know, we see something like, I don't know what that is. Those aren't the same.
But I think the problem is that with the Vishnu model, it's not evidence in any one direction. It's evidence that could go in any, it could be evidence for any number of models, because it's not really explaining why that's more correct than any other model. It's got the prediction, which is what you're emphasizing, but it doesn't have
Wait, what do you mean?
explanatory power.
What do you mean by
what a model does.
explaining why it's more correct than other models? I don't understand what you're saying there, because the problem of underdetermination in
Okay,
science means that every single prediction ever made, all evidence can be explained by infinitely many hypotheses, and there's literally no way to show which one is correct. So there's no way in science to show why our model of heliocentrism is more correct than we're in a matrix and it's actually the world is flat. Like, there's no way to do that. There's no way to differentiate between which of those models is truly correct. We just say, oh, well, this one makes successful predictions, and so we accept this one.
Well, it doesn't have to be truly 100% correct, but the thing is, if you are just saying, because that's what you are doing with this new model, you are saying, but with the heliocentrism model, you are going much further, and you are saying it works this way, and if it works this way, we should see this result.
No, that's
With
exactly what you're doing in the Vishnu model.
This result.
No, that's exactly what you're doing in the Vishnu model. If Vishnu exists, he has these properties, it works this way, here's what we expect to see. The world is 4.5 billion years old. That's the exact same thing.
I don't know. I'm having trouble making that work in my brain, because it seems like with the heliocentric model, you're explaining things in a naturalistic way that one thing leads to the other, and you're explaining the steps, and your result should be the prediction. Whereas in the Vishnu model, you're just saying a god, magic, and then a prediction, and then the prediction happens to be true. That doesn't actually stand the same kind of rigor as like a scientific prediction or a scientific model.
Well, it does, because they're saying that the god sleeps for X number of years, and the world is created when the god falls asleep, and then it's destroyed when he wakes up. And so the mechanism causing the creation of the world is the god falling asleep and having dreams. So they're literally giving a mechanism and saying that this mechanism causes this to happen at exactly this rate, which gives you the number. That's how they get to the 4.5 billion years old. They say there's this pattern in his sleep patterns, and when he wakes up this often and falls asleep this often, that's how this is created. So they're giving a mechanism just like gravity, and saying if this mechanism of the god's sleep patterns is the creation mechanism, then we would expect to see the world to be created at 4.5 billion years ago.
All right, Tom, let me give you one.
You're breaking up. You're breaking up really bad right now.
So suppose I make a. Oh, sorry. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
I was just about to make one more point. Okay. So suppose I make a prediction that I am going to shoot a 3-pointer or a half quarter, and I mean, like, I don't even really want to get into the prediction point. But suppose in my model, like, the prediction is true. Let's say that happened. I got the prediction right. But in my model, there's no evidence that that model would actually produce that result. Then the model is not more substantiated just because it got it right. The model itself is scrutinized to the same degree as your conclusion, because you don't just have a novel prediction, dude. You got to have a conclusion, and you've got to explain why your model got it right.
I agree, but it does that. The God model does that.
No, it does, because it doesn't explain why a being having a dream would create the universe.
Well, it doesn't need to explain literally everything. Like, quantum mechanics doesn't explain literally everything. It says there's this one thing that we see, and if this one thing that we see is a result of these properties we hypothesize, then it's evidence of those properties. It doesn't need to explain everything. Like, no model explains everything. That's not a
no. I know. No model explains everything. Actually, no model explains anything perfectly, and all models are wrong, but some are useful. But the thing is, if your model is making these huge leaps in logic, or these huge leaps, and it's like, well, if I won the lottery 10 years ago, then I mean, and somehow you end up at this prediction, that doesn't mean all those other things I decide to just jam into my model are correct just because I got the prediction right. You know, I've
there's a
got to have some
causal
kind of
relation.
coherent explanation.
So like, if there's a causal relation between them, then it's evidence for all of them. So if you say the world was created 4.5 billion years ago because God did it, and God also made pink unicorns, so it's reasonable to believe pink unicorns exist, that's perfectly fine. Like, that's a consequence of the model, and the model made successful predictions. So there seems to be a disconnect between you saying that the model doesn't explain anything simply because not all of the things in the model are demonstrated. Like, there are many predictions that Einstein made that hadn't been confirmed yet, like gravitational waves. There was no evidence of gravitational waves until recently, but his model was accepted because the predictions he did make were found to be correct. The curvature of light around the sun, perihelion of Mercury. So because of the some things he made that were correct, even though he made a bunch of other stuff that he said were consequences of the model because it was caused by the same fundamental feature of the model, were also accepted. So in the same thing in the God case, if the God predicts that God created the world 4.5 billion years ago and we discover that, then that's also reason to accept the other things the book predicts God did, because it's the same mechanism. God did it, which is the same mechanism in general relativity where gravity did it. There's no substantive difference between gravity did it and caused this thing that we can see, oh, and these other things we can't see yet, and God did these things that we can see, oh, and these other things we can't see yet. So those would be equivalent models there in that they have an explanation which explains things we have discovered and things that we haven't discovered, and making predictions, and that would be reasonable to believe both if the predictions were correct.
Okay, I'm going to let someone else talk, but yeah, we'll get back on it, man. Thanks.
Yep.
Good answers, by the way. I appreciated it.
Thank you. Appreciate you coming on and chatting. Anybody else got anything you want to chat about?
I want to clarify something real quick. When you say, when you're talking about evidence and, distinguishing reality from imagination, presumably, at least to my mind, you're talking about some sort of percentage evaluation of likelihood where, if you have evidence, then it is moving the percentage of likelihood that you think that something is true.
Sure.
Based on that evidence, right?
Sure.
So you would also presumably say anything that gets you from 20% sure that it's not the case, right? Or that it is the case, to 21% sure that it is the case or not the case. Like, that's still evidence, even if it doesn't get you over the 50% line, right?
Sure. I'd say there's probably some limit. So like if it adds 0.0000001% or something, the fact that you can argue it makes that little of a difference means it's essentially the same as zero, because I think you can argue things make a difference when they don't make a difference. So I would say there has to be some measurable difference.
Sure. And in my mind, when you're saying that, the prediction that the universe is 4.5 billion years old, you're essentially conceding something like that. You're saying it is evidence, but it doesn't get me over the 50% threshold. So
right. Yep.
Evidence can exist that doesn't get you, to believing it, right?
Yep.
Right. And so when he's arguing with you, or not even arguing with you, when he's trying to understand your point, to me, it's like he's missing that part.
I don't think so. Because I think his point is more that I felt the same way a long time ago, that there's some substantive difference between supernatural and natural hypotheses in that the quality of the theory is different in some way. So I think his argument is that the quality of the naturalistic hypothesis is different in that they're more detailed in some way. It's more detailed how you go from gravity to gravitational waves and the stuff we see, and that the more detail in the hypothesis makes it a better hypothesis than the supernatural hypothesis or something along those lines. But I've never...
So
go ahead.
If I ask you to answer the way you suspect he would answer, right, and I say something like, well, if it wasn't just that prediction, if it were some large number of predictions that they got right, even with no mechanism that they could show, right, there would presumably be some point that you would believe that they're onto something, right? Such that you would maybe believe, right?
Yeah, so the way I think he would answer is something like, it would still be unreasonable because there is not enough detail in the hypothesis to infer that those predictions are rational to make, and so it's likely they just got lucky, something along those lines. Because I think the difference he's trying to outline is the fact that the scientific models seem more detailed. I don't know the best language for that.
Intuitively detailed.
Yeah, it's not
Yeah,
like...
I think I get what you're saying. My criticism of that is that let's take it away from religion for a second, right? If I know a guy that can't tell me how he knows the upcoming lottery numbers, but he guesses it right 10 times in a row, right? When he tells me the 11th, like, I'm gonna go buy that lottery
tickets.
ticket.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying, right? Like, I don't care if he can tell me how he knows, right? And I doubt that it's the case that he's much different than me. Maybe he is, right? Maybe you're right, but I suspect not.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's the same conclusion I came to, because long time ago, I felt the same way, that there's got to be some difference between scientific models that make predictions that we accept versus God models. Like, we shouldn't accept the God model predictions, right? Because it's just silly. But when you actually get into it, you can't really find a substantive difference there. Like, when you think that scientific models are more detailed, it's like, not really. They're really not. They're really just the same kind of just making predictions and trying to explain stuff. And there's a lot they can't explain, in the same way that supernatural stuff can't be explained, and they just work. And that's the difference.
Yeah, no, I think I'm more on board with you, and I think I was there once too. But I think that it's usually, I point to that sort of contradiction where somebody will intuitively understand that if somebody's been real good at guessing a bunch of lottery numbers, that they wouldn't bother asking the question how.
Yep.
Right. So, yeah. Anyways, yeah, I get it. I was just curious what you thought about it.
Anybody else got any questions? All right, I'm going to get off. Thanks for joining the after show, guys. Thanks for joining the live stream. Appreciate the super chats, and I will see you guys later.
Bye, TJ.